Hello, fellow readers. Thank you for joining us for another edition of Page Turners Plus. The last time you saw us, we were discussing Let Me Liberate You by Andie Davis. Today, Andy is with us to have a conversation about the novel. Thanks for joining us, Andy.
Thank you for having me. Very happy to be here.
I'll start off the questions. When I read Let Me Liberate You, I was really surprised because it was touted as your first novel. Didn't read like a first novel to me. It felt like the work of a very seasoned writer. So I'm very sure that there are things you haven't told us, and I'm inviting you to tell us all those things about your writing career that you haven't told us.
Well, thank you. That's very kind of you to say. I guess I'll start with the most obvious fact, which is that even though this is my debut novel, I'm actually a 55-year-old debutante. So I've been writing for quite some time, although this is my first novel. I would say that as a Caribbean person. Yeah, I grew up with my mom is Bajan, my dad is Antiguan, and they both are excellent storytellers, as I believe all Caribbean people are. I think we're all natural storytellers. We can spin a yarn out of anything. And as a child, I was the middle of three, and I was always that one who, when it was time for the adults to be talking, I would hide myself under the table and pretend to be engrossed in whatever game my imagination had created. But really, my ears were attuned to the adult talk because I was fascinated by the things that they were talking about, and also specifically by the way they expressed themselves. I love the way that we talk, and you'll see in my novel that there's lots and lots of back and forth dialogue because I just like the way that we talk and express ourselves, the way we express ideas. So there's that. There's just a love for the language and for our dialects. And then, I was an English major in college. I, just did what I loved to do. I had no idea what I was going to do with it. Ended up taking an errant path into corporate law, which did not offer a lot of, let's say, creative latitude at the time. And then just found my way back to my true love, which is language and writing. So now, in my day job, I work as a sort of an advisor on global development projects, but having to do with sustainability, stakeholder engagement, outreach, and communications. And in all of those things, there's a strong element of writing, of creating messaging that corresponds to what people really need and that resonates with audiences. So I have a lot of practice taking ideas and translating them into language that audiences understand. But my first love is really just expressing the stories that I think are around us in abundance as Caribbean people.
Thanks for that. That was wonderful to hear, and I think we all agree with you about the fact that Caribbean people are natural storytellers. That's why we enjoy reading Caribbean literature so much. So let's jump into the book a bit. When we meet Sabri, we meet her in New York, and we learn that she's an artist, and we also learn that she's often compared with Jean-Michel Basquiat in the New York art circles. Can you tell us a little bit about who he was and why you wanted to highlight him in the novel?
Yes, happy to. So Jean-Michel Basquiat was a Haitian Puerto Rican artist. He started off as a graffiti artist and then sort of translated that style onto canvas as a painter. And he was quite prominent in the 70s and in the early 80s. Um, he was someone who had sort of a visual language that was very distinct. It grew out of, as I say, graffiti culture, but he also made references to Haitian, traditional Haitian voodoo symbols, African symbols. He was a great student of anatomy and physiology. And so he drew from a very wide range of references, whether that be African history, Haitian culture, Puerto Rican, Taino culture, very, very wide. Um, and he was heralded he was embraced by the sort of mainstream art world, like the fine arts community, which is dominated by white people, and his work, sold very well. And I think he was one of the first contemporary Black artists to be so embraced and to sell very well. However, a lot of his messages, the actual messages, if you translate what he was writing on the page, what he was creating on canvas, tended to be either critical or ironic or poking fun at class divides, race divides, and just sort of wealth, and indeed the whole fine art infrastructure itself. But I think a lot of that was overlooked because he became the symbol of cool. So for a lot of the wealthy uh, collectors and gallerists, to have a Basquiat work was almost a badge of authenticity and of your cool, because you could because it meant that you were sort of part of whatever was hip in those days. I think the messaging went by the wayside. And I think Basquiat himself had a conflicted relationship with fame, as indeed Sabri, the protagonist of this novel, does. She's not quite sure whether she's being embraced purely on her merits as an artist, or whether by embracing her, the art world is saying something about itself, or conferring unto itself certain attributes that it might not have earned. And even though she hasn't articulated it in that way, she does feel a bit uncomfortable and unsettled with this rapid embrace of herself. This particular character, Sabri, happens to be a tall, lanky, dark-skinned, very dark-skinned woman who's also bald from having suffered alopecia as a child. And so she has this sort of Amazonian Grace Jones type quality that makes her this ripe candidate for people's visual imagination, right? She's very Instagrammable. She looks cool in a party. People send her clothes because they think they look good on her. And she has a sense that there's something uncomfortable with all of this attention that she's been getting. And when she's compared to Basquiat, because she is a fine arts photographer, she herself isn't sure, as somebody who admires Basquiat as an artist, whether she really deserves to be in the same echelon as Basquiat. But it's also true that Basquiat himself wasn't comfortable with all of the reasons behind, the motivations behind people's intense attention on him and the spotlight on him. Basquiat ended up struggling with substance abuse and dying quite young at the age of 28. And when the novel opens, our main character, Sabri, is 29 and just feeling increasingly uncomfortable with the accolades being heaped upon her by the art world. So that's where the comparison comes from.
I want to really pick back up on this question about Basquiat, because I found it really interesting the way you were using him, as well as kind of pointing to his kind of celebrity status, I guess, as a Black contemporary artist. He's mates with Warhol. He's at Studio 54. I wonder if there's, I could be completely wrong, so this is my interpretation. But I wonder if there's something you're saying about the ways in which Black people have to navigate success in white contexts, when they're searching particularly for kind of authenticity. Because there's nothing to, we don't know actually whether whether Sabri's a good photographer, right? We know that people are going to pay her huge amounts of money, right? We know that she's feted in the New York art sales, but we don't know that she's good. We know that she got, so is there something in that about that Basquiat kind of harks at as well, like the comparisons to Basquiat, are they deserved or undeserved? It's something that he himself has ever happened that you're kind of pointing to.
Absolutely, and that's a very astute observation. At no point does the book decide whether Sabri is good or not. And indeed, she herself doesn't know if she's good, because without giving too much away, it was really a sort of traumatic experience that drew her to photography in the first place. Coming to a new country and feeling a need to escape. And the place that she chose to escape happened to be a photographer's dark room. And that's where she sort of found herself and blossomed in that way. So because she didn't come to it through what she imagines Basquiat, through the same route that she imagines Basquiat to have come from, which is a place of passion and ideas, she sort of chafes at the comparison. And she also doesn't really know, in fact, whether or not she's good, because when people are feting her, they're not really talking about the work, they're talking about her. And there is something that I think that I was trying to get at with the way in which Black cool, if you will, is appropriated in these white spaces. There were lots and lots and lots of people who would pay fortunes to own a Basquiat without ever really penetrating what the message is on that canvas. Because for them, the job is done once they have a Basquiat hanging on the wall of their, penthouse, right? And I think that she senses that and is uncomfortable with it. And by all accounts, Basquiat himself was uncomfortable with it, but at the same time, somewhat seduced by, this attention and all this money, and, more power to him. You can hardly blame him for that. But it was almost as if he and his patrons were sort of talking past each other in a way. And I think that when it comes to Sabri, her own sort of discomfort and the sheer speed of her ascent into these spaces gives her this acute case of imposter syndrome that causes her to want to run all the way back to the last time she felt grounded, which was when she was a little girl in Barbados.
Okay, you've mentioned Sabri being a little girl in Barbados. She goes back to Barbados to ground herself, as you mentioned. And when she returns, almost immediately, she becomes an activist, completely by accident. Um, so, how much of her accidental activism do you think is sparked by culture shock?
Okay, I just have to say these are wonderful questions. I could not have written better questions myself if I were to write a dream interview. So thank you. Um, there is some element of her misreading cultural cues, right? Because, she's been gone for 20 years. And when she, again, without giving too much away, when she was in Barbados, she wasn't operating in quite the same class in which she finds herself now, just on pure sort of by an income metric. But also, she's now living in the home of or staying with wealthy relatives who are wealthier than her own family, nuclear family, was when she was in Barbados. And so there's a way in which, even if she had remained in Barbados, she would have been less exposed to the dynamics of that household, especially as concerns the relationship with the domestic staff. But coming from the United States, where, only the wealthiest people can afford to have, essentially a housekeeper who's there every day cooking for you, nannies, like the whole sort of domestic entourage that at least a generation ago was more commonly found in, let's say, middle or upper middle class Caribbean societies. It's very much a culture shock for her to see, a housekeeper. And this housekeeper, by appearances, as far as she can tell, is very self-effacing, very, sort of meek, doesn't make eye contact, doesn't even make a sound when she walks. And all of these things, I think, fascinate her. And she tries to, I think there's a part of her that sees herself very dimly in this other being, in the sense that here's a person who is almost a fish out of water. She's, the only one of her kind among the others. In this case, the only sort of housekeeper working amongst this larger family. I think Sabri sees maybe some sort of parallel between herself and this character in the circles that she moves in, not because she feels less than or diminished by those circles necessarily, but just because she feels like she's not fully seen. And so her first instinct is to try to almost ingratiate herself to this character and endear herself to this character. But the housekeeper is not there for that. She's here to do a job. She's not here to make friends. She's very clear on who she is. She's very clear on what these dynamics are and how to navigate them. And so there's that clash that exists where Sabri needs her to be something that she has no interest in being. So it's a culture shock. And yet she does trip this sort of fault line in Barbadian society that is actually there. So even though she's misreading the cultural cues and she's sort of clumsily stumbling into it, she's not entirely wrong. And I think that's where a lot of the tension and the satire of the novel comes from.
Can I jump in and ask a question before Francine would normally do? Just thinking about the kind of differences in the two places that she spends time in, right? Her role in New York art life. But when she gets to Barbados, she's similarly feted for her New York accomplishments, right? So is there something in there about how she's again finding herself as unsort of deserving of opportunities? And it's simply that in Barbados, she finds a way to kind of exploit that, or exploit's not the right word, but to take advantage of that in a way that is useful and gives her a sense of purpose.
Right. Well, remember that the platform that she has initially in Barbados is not, there was no one expected that she would sort of take that and launch the crusade that she ultimately does. She was really there. She is feted as someone who has, gone away and, done her family and done her country proud. And she's willing to accept that, even though it's not the reason she came home. She's willing to accept that because there's something about it that feels safe and authentic. Because, as she says at some point in the book, all the people who are lauding her knew her, or at least knew her family, before she was who she was. So she does feel seen. She feels less exoticized. She feels as though that embrace is an embrace of familial love. And it is, but also sort of, healthily seasoned with, the vanity of her aunt and her cousin, who see her as, as themselves basking in her reflected brilliance as this famous artist who's come back from America. So it doesn't immediately land on her, the ways in which she is once again, being used as sort of a projection of other people's fantasies and desires and need for greatness by association. Because her own mission to just feel grounded and to feel seen and to feel loved, she finds that in some of that attention and accolade. So once again, in a sense, they're sort of talking past each other, or their motives are at cross purposes. But within that intersection, they each find what they need. So it seems to work until it doesn't, of course.
So we mentioned the clash with, is it Isilda? Isilda, that's how it's pronounced. And we were wondering if there's any credence to the idea that her declaration that she doesn't want to be liberated bears a relationship with a statement that's often been wrongly attributed to Harriet Tubman, that she could have led more people out of slavery if they had realized that they were enslaved. Were you playing with that idea at all?
I wish I could say that I was, but and then maybe that wasn't the phrase that was in my head as I was working with when I was developing Isilda's storyline. But in a way, I suppose I am, because Isilda is a very interesting character. She's someone who has an adaptability to her. She gets the lay of the land, and then she figures out how to navigate it. So when we first meet her, she's perfectly content to work, at the household where she does, because she's figured out their schedule. She's figured out when she can, relax. She's figured out, how to deal with the cat, who she, just finds very annoying, because the cat is the only household member who's around all day when she's there. There are other things she'd rather be doing. And so her life is quite well ordered and navigated as far as she's concerned. And the larger issue of whether she should aspire to different or higher things, whether her very place in society is something that is ripe for reconsideration. These are questions that not only do they not consume her, she's almost annoyed when other people, spend any time thinking about those things. And you do see that sometimes, right, where there are people who are so terrified of the consequences of change or attempting to change, that they find a way to just sort of make their peace with the status quo. We see this all the time. I mean, you can just look around the world and see that there's a clash now, as we're facing a moment of crisis on a planetary level, and there's a camp that wants to rally forces and do something about it, and there are others who just sort of say, listen, do we even know that this is real? Let's just kind of make our peace with it, or let's go back to this halcyon past where things were better, which of course is never quite the way people are imagining it, right? I think as things start to bubble around Isilda, and as more people start to become conscious that they have power that they can be exercising in a way that perhaps they haven't before, Isilda feels just sort of annoyed by it. I think she wishes that, we could all just figure out where we fall in the hierarchy of this society, and then just sort of swim in our own lane. And yet, on a very personal level, we see that she has a crusade of her own, which is to combat some of the health challenges that her family has been dealing with, and that in Barbados and in the Caribbean writ large, we deal with on a massive level. And so I don't know that she would call her journey a crusade, but she is determined to find, healthier options, healthier food options, ways of producing, Bajan, delicacies in a way that's healthier, that, for example, might have kept her father alive but she wouldn't see that as a crusade. You know, for her, it's, this is just what's available. This is just what I'm doing. So when Sabri comes along and suggests that she needs liberating, there are a few things at play. First, there's the fact that this Yankee girl is coming, you know, into her territory and telling her what to do when she knows the lay of her land better than this woman does, right? There is the fact that she has actually possibly put her own job in jeopardy by attempting to use her as a symbol of oppression, when not only does she not feel oppressed, but she doesn't want to be a symbol. She wants to just be a person who comes and does her job on a very transactional basis and goes home. And so she resents this idea that she needs to be something more than she is. And then I think she also can pick up on the fact that Sabri's own motivations are perhaps unexamined. Why does she need to become this crusader? You know, were there people to liberate back in New York? But no, she comes back home and she chooses to make this a crusade, and then tries to rope Isilda in a way that she herself, Sabri herself, might have resented when people try to project their ideas of what she should be onto her. And so without knowing enough about Sabri's backstory, Isilda can, I think, detect that there are forces at play here and that there are motivations that aren't entirely wholesome and that are damaging and reckless, that Sabri is not taking on. And Sabri is so blinded by the possibilities of reinforcing her own sense of self that she totally pushes to the side any objections Isilda might have, because she's so locked in on this idea that she needs to be this thing in order to justify, I guess, the attention and the place that she gets in the world. So everyone is sort of operating at from motivations, personal motivations that are woefully unexamined, and other people around them are sort of bearing the consequences of that failure to fully examine and understand why they're doing what they do.
I read Isilda as more empowered and more sure of who she was than Sabri. I don't know if that was your intention, but that is how I read her. And Sabri does, in her efforts to liberate the oppressed working people of Barbados, she does traffic in what I regard as oppression porn, or she does try to traffic in oppression porn. I don't think she perceives it as that, but there is a point where she decides she's going to go look for some oppressed people to photograph, to make her point. And when the campaign to liberate these oppressed people isn't happening, it isn't producing results as fast as she thinks they should happen, she's wondering about that. You know, why isn't it magic? Why isn't this society magically trans being trans being changed into a more egalitarian society? So I just wanted to know if you were playing with this idea of oppression porn, and or was it just me dreaming this up?
No, you're absolutely right. As I mentioned earlier, I work in global development. And when it comes to building narratives of who needs help, who the beneficiaries are, and indeed even what they need, it's a fairly recent development to actually ask the people that you want to help what it is that they need, and to encourage, to build your support around their priorities. There's a scene in the book where I skewer that sort of what you call oppression porn, because it is a reality. We see it in global development. You know, people must not only be shown to be suffering, but you sort of turn it up a little bit, dial up the volume, right? Like make the suffering, sort of add a little bit more dust on and dirt onto the suffering, because, you know, to be honest, that's how the funding comes through very often. And there's I could have written an entire satire just on the dynamics of the whole global development project, especially as relates to us here in the Caribbean, where we're now considered mostly middle income countries, but still, you know, our needs are still very real and very great. Inequality is rising. How do we deal with those things? So there's a lot we can say about that. And I think Sabri herself, before she realizes how much worse it could get when she starts to work with the people on the global development side, just has this idea that, she needs to document what she's seeing. That's where it starts. But the images that she chooses are very much colored by her notions of what a hard life must look like, right? So, for example, people walking around barefoot or shimmying up a coconut tree barefoot, which, for you and me might be a Saturday morning, for her is, oppression. Where's the brace? Where's the protective goggles? But, if you grow up seeing that, that doesn't strike you as an oppressive, lifestyle at all. As a matter of fact, good on you that you still have a coconut tree in your yard that's bearing fruit, right? So she definitely is looking at it through a foreign lens, but I don't think she would call it depression porn. When she starts to work with people who are very used to packaging challenges, and pitching them as interventions to wealthy funders in northern countries, let's say, they're very much used to having it to tell a story that is based on despair, deprivation, acute need, acute poverty, because they've learned, and it's not because they're bad people or because they want to traffic in oppression porn, it's because they've learned that that's how you can attract funding and resources. So when she presents these stories, and she's quite surprised to see, maybe a somewhat cynical tone where people are saying, well, we need more oppressed women, among your stories. We need them to look really hard luck. And, by the way, we need you to donate these images for free because, we don't have a lot of money to pay you. That, I think, shocks her a little bit. But again, she doesn't question the extent to which she herself might also have been participating in what you and I are calling oppression porn, but she might not see it that way. But at the end of the day, whether it is oppression porn or whether it is documenting, what's before your own eyes, I think the pathos of it is that, everyone means well, right? This is all to try to address a need. It's just the hoops you have to jump through to address that need, I think, can sometimes compromise not just the truth of what you're seeing, but even compromise sometimes the dignity of the people that you're supposed to be helping. And there's so much more we could say about that. Maybe I'll put it in another book, but I'll leave it there for now.
You talked about it being a satire, and you said you might have another book in there. We had quite a discussion about satire as a tool to tell this story. Some of us felt it was really super effective and brilliantly done, and others were like, "I'm not sure about satire." And we realized we don't really see that much satire in Caribbean fiction. So, how did you come about that choice artistically?
Yeah, well, I think that honestly, satire is my mental default setting. I tend to sort of find humor in all kinds of things, even things that might be a bit dark. There's always something a little bit just sort of all too human and comical about situations that we find ourselves in. I also think that satire is, that spoonful of sugar that makes sometimes provocative, and sometimes thorny ideas go down a little bit, right? And when you're talking about, as this book does, issues of class dynamics, issues of inequality, issues of complexion dynamics, what I call a pigmentocracy, which, Barbados and, many of almost all of our islands very much are. And, we don't necessarily talk about those things that much. I think that satire is a great way to sort of to embark on those kinds of conversations. Um, on a personal note, I also was very much aware that even though I'm a dyed-in-the-wool Barbadian, I consider myself a global citizen with Caribbean roots. I was also aware that as somebody who is commenting on Bajan society without living in Barbados, that I needed to thread that needle carefully. It could be read as imperious for me to come in and just sort of, declare, some truths about Barbadian society when it's not my everyday lived experience. Yes, I'm Barbadian. Yes, I spend a lot of time in Barbados, but I don't live here every day. Yes, I did copious amounts of research for months at a time, but I don't live in Barbados. I live in New York, and there might have been, I wanted to avoid the perception that I'm just parachuting in and, commenting harshly on my society and then, retreating to, a comfortable life elsewhere. And so because of that, I think that satire is an additional bonus where, we're laughing, things that happen are comical. And also every character in this novel, at least it was my intention, I hope I've achieved that, every character in this novel, however flawed, however much I may personally dislike or disagree with them, is a well-rounded three-dimensional character who wakes up in the morning thinking that they're just doing their best, even if it goes horribly wrong, even if it's completely, undercooked. They all mean well, and they're all very real. Even characters are just in passing. No one's a trope, no one's a stereotype, no one's a villain or a hero. Everyone's just a three-dimensional flawed being. And so if you have a clash of three-dimensional flawed beings, that's sort of a recipe. Dealing with converging on issues that really affect them all, I think satire is the best vehicle for that kind of dynamic.
Well, now that you've said that, I'm feeling a little bit bad about how much we trashed Lisette in our discussion last week.
To be fair, I did
No,
too.
trash her, drag her, trash her.
But so speaking of Lisette, one of the things we concluded was that her relationship with Damien seemed to be a natural continuum of the path that Aggie's father set his daughters on. Aggie's father's thing was his daughters were going to marry up. And so Lisette is marrying up even more. Do you agree with that conclusion that we came to?
I absolutely agree with that conclusion. Lisette is the product of a mother who was very careful to marry very, very well. And as the book says, not only would she never have dreamed of marrying someone of her own social class, but her own father would not have been someone who she would consider. Ironically, since he's the one who has reinforced these ideas of you're better than the people around you. And so by the time Lisette comes along, she's got this mom who has sort of found her comfort to some extent. It's not the same comfort of someone who was born into wealth, as we see, because Aggie as we can see, is quite she's quite ruffleable, let's say, right? But Lisette has been born into this, and yet her mother is this force of nature. She's a well-known socialite. She's a high-powered lawyer, and there's a part of Lisette that feels a need to sort of compete with that, even though she's been born into the kind of comfort that doesn't require her to be competitive in order to survive. That competitiveness comes just from her. And so one way that she can one up the things that her mother's been able to achieve is to do the thing that her mother has not been able to, which is to bag a Bajan white man, right? Like the ultimate elite bastion of wealth, the ultimate closed door that remains closed. She is determined to pry that door open. And in the course of the book, we see, maybe Lisette doesn't see it, but we certainly see the compromises that she makes in order to lay claim to that achievement. And, she makes her bed and she lays in it proverbially, and considers herself, having done very well as a result of it. You and I may look at the choices she makes askance, but as the Americans say, you can't tell her nothing, because she's gotten where she wants to go, where neither her mother nor anyone around her has been able to. Maybe this is also a time to say that the complexion and race dynamics here in Barbados are interesting and often sort of under-examined. Even though we talk about it all the time, but there's a way in which we sort of talk past it, and part of the reason for that is that very often Barbadian whites, even people that I went to school with, people that I know, stop short of engaging in those kinds of conversations. So there's sort of a cliff. There's a silence that ensues. The closer we get to the heart of the matter, the quieter like those conversations become, when they should be getting louder. And this book is not setting out to vilify Barbadian whites in any way, but it is meant to examine this sort of hierarchical structure that we still have, where white Barbadians are sort of like the unseen peak, right? Like they're the ones sort of above the clouds, right, if you will, like in the pyramid. And there's not a lot of engagement. There's not a lot of cross-pollination. They control vast swaths of this economy to this day. but we don't really talk about that. And you know, the things that happen in the book where, for example, I don't think this is giving too much away, you know, it's almost a badge of pride if Lizette is allowed into her white boyfriend's home, or if she's allowed into the home at all. These are things that go on in 2024. It still happens. So Lizette sees her association with this Bajan white boyfriend as a tremendous achievement. And you know, that in itself, I think, is also a tool of the satire.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I lived in Martinique for a number of years, and they similarly have a white ruling class that is descended from plantocracy and remain plantocracy. Um, you know, we call them the Beke. And so definitely see that kind of parallel. I think what was interesting is that we don't often, and I was thinking about it in a couple of Barbadian novels that we've read recently. I'm thinking of Jasmine Seeley's The Island of Forgetting, and also looking at the other end of the social scale, Sherry Jones's How the One-Armed Sister Sweeps Her House. And again, these kind of really close, deep dives into like social dynamics in Barbados in ways that I'm not sure if we always get that all the time in other Caribbean countries' literature, right? It seems to be a recurring theme. But even if you take it back, I think, to George Lamming, perhaps it's something that he's pointing to in his very early works, novels. And so I guess the question is, do we need to conclude from your novel and Bajan literature more broadly that the class system in Barbados it's unless there's a reckoning, it is unsurmountable?
Yeah, well, to go back to the first point you were making, I think that Barbados, and I believe St. Kitts, there are a few islands where that white planter class wasn't sort of remote. It wasn't an overseer culture for example, like in a place like Antigua, where you know you trained Black people to do the work an overseer would take, and then they went back to England. There's a class that remained in Barbados, remained in St. Kitts, one or two other countries. Of course, Martinique, they're still part of the Republic, right? So they never left. And indeed, side note, France never leaves anywhere that it conquers because I don't know how.
Well, they don't leave without a fight. Is what we say.
Yeah,
they don't leave without a fight.
But yeah, exactly. Not without a fight. Quite right. But so Barbados is one of those places where that white planter class remained, that superstructure remained, and the descendants of those whites, more or less undiluted, have remained in Barbados today. I mean, there's some dilution, of course, in terms of white people mixing with other people, but you still find lots of like pure Bajan whites. And again, much could be said about that, given that we're a population of 285,000, but and that white people are just a small sliver of that population. But we'll leave that aside for now. The class structure here is fascinating because Barbados has had a thriving middle class, giant middle class, which is now, I think, starting to erode on both sides, where it's harder to get in and it's harder to sort of rise into, just because of the same forces of global inequality that are affecting other places around the world. But by and large, we've had this large middle class that has stayed, and where in many countries you would have seen a brain drain, in Barbados, I think we had, if anything, something of a brain gain, because people would study and they'd want to come back to Barbados. So the structure is there. And because there's so many of us that are comfortable and well-fed, for a very long time, we weren't necessarily in a huge hurry to investigate or dismantle actively those structures. I think that what we're starting to see now, and a lot of it you might argue is symbolic, is a re-examining and a dismantling, just a chipping away at that superstructure. So, for example, we had a statue of Lord Nelson in the middle of Bridgetown for years. That has been done away with, and in its place, we now have Independence Square with the symbols of us having broken the chains. We are very active. We're in the forefront of the question around reparations. And starting with Drax Hall and what are going to be the consequences and the reparations owed to the enslaved who worked on Drax Hall plantation and who made the Drax and the House of Lords very, very wealthy for generations. So we're starting to have these conversations now, But the truth is, as far as I've been able to observe, we're sort of, operating, first it's the symbols and the structures, and we're moving in sort of very slow concentric circles all the way to the center, which is, hello, Beijing whites of 2024. What does this mean for us today? We have come a long way in terms of, I think for all intents and purposes, it's something of a meritocracy, right? You can be a very poor kid, but your, healthcare will be, maybe you won't have like access to the best equipment in a private clinic, but you'll have access to quality healthcare. You'll have access to a quality primary education, and there are avenues towards social mobility through education. That's something that we're very, very proud of in Barbados, and that's still the case. It's getting harder, however, to own property. It's getting harder to make your way, for example, on a civil servant salary, given the state of inflation in this country. And so a lot of the infrastructure that was put in place around and after independence that has allowed the burgeoning of this middle class that for decades was comfortable enough to not really want to sort of rattle the cages and seriously re-examine the dynamics of this country. The fact that that's starting to, we're reaching a tipping point where we're no longer, it's harder to be as comfortable as even our parents were. And so that's coinciding with this need to really re-examine these superstructures. Again, I don't hear, maybe they're happening, I don't hear the direct conversations happening between not Lord Drax, who's sitting in the House of Lords in the UK, but the Bajan whites who are here now converting their sugarcane fields into golf courses, into gated communities, into all of the things that we have now, a conversation with what our society should look like today. And we still do have those vestiges where even though a dark-skinned person can, become a member of parliament, can become a business owner, and entrepreneurship indeed is starting to thrive now, as I think the civil service is becoming harder to live on. Even though all those things are true and all those dynamics are in play, it's still all within the context of a structure where the lighter you are, the higher and the better your prospects. I mean, my mother, for example, was a woman who had, she passed away last year, but she was a woman who had lighter skin than I do, and kind of that a textured hair that was sort of a looser curl pattern, and that look is what allowed her to get a job in an office, because she had the look of a front office person. This is not 1860 anything. We're talking about a generation ago, right? And so that the opportunities afforded to her were what allowed us to have access to certain resources. They're very, very real, direct, immediate consequences to that pigmentocracy structure that has been in place. Meanwhile, I know people, who couldn't take the common entrance exam because in their day, in order to take the common entrance exam, you had to own a pair of shoes. And that was a way of, yes, right here in Barbados, people alive today whose economic and sort of educational prospects were severely curtailed because they did not own a pair of shoes. And that pair of shoes was a proxy for class. That pair of shoes was to make sure that if you, didn't come from, if you weren't to the manor born, or you didn't come from the right kind of family, no point wasting a secondary school education. And can you imagine? Like to us now, it sounds barbaric, but that was, I mean, the guy is alive today who that happened to, right? So the pigmentocracy that was so entrenched in those days has very direct consequences to the places and the prospects that we have today as Barbadians and as Caribbean people. I don't know if all the islands had that, but we had it. And so I think the conversations that we're having now that are sort of engaging with the global reparations conversation, that are creating of sort of Black pride and independence and self-determination. Those are wonderful conversations. They are a starting point to the far more uncomfortable and picayune conversations to come that I don't see white Barbadians, running to engage in, but it's going to have to happen. So is classism immutable, to answer your original question? We're chipping away at it very, very slowly. I think there are a lot of us, there are a lot of Isildas, there are a lot of Lizettes, and then there's some other characters who want to see what the life can look like around that corner. But it's going to happen slowly, but I think it is happening very, very slowly and gradually. So, let's check back in 10 years' time and see where we are. That's what I would say.
On that very provocative note, I have to say that we've run out of time. Um, before we close this program, you will hear Andy reading an excerpt from the novel. And the next time you see us, we're going to be discussing Ingrid Prasad's The Lost Love Songs of Voices Sing. Thank you for joining us. Bye.
Grantley Adams International Airport was the usual hive of inertia it became whenever a large jet was due in. People sauntered into the arrivals area like cowboys entering a saloon, exchanging terse nods and angling for the best positions to stand and wait for passengers. Jingling keys, scrolling phones, checking watches by the half minute, and shifting from flip to flop, they took in the scene around them, a scene rewarding to the well-trained eye. For those who live in a big place, an airport holds limited thrill. But in a small place, it is the downbeat of a pulse, the reassuring prelude to one's blip on the radar screen. Small place people tend to keep their antenna raised to catch the signal, convinced that the world is happening somewhere else. A single sweeping gaze is as good as an hour's observation if one knows what to look for, as Bajans do. A simple technique allows them to calibrate with molecular precision the general decency of a crowd and their own place within it. This is key to determining how one should behave, how one should stand, which muscles to clench and which ones to relax, the appropriate range of swivel in one's neck, where and on whom to let one's gaze fall. In any setting, this technique is second nature to a Bajan, though anyone with enough will and perseverance can master it too. Survey the landscape using a melanometer. Those not issued a melanometer at birth, as most Bajans are, have to develop one through practice. Like a photographer's light meter, which calculates the ratio of light to shadow, the melanometer measures the collective melanin content of a crowd and calculates the average tonal factor, the ATF. This ATF can be any point along the spectrum of complexion, from barley water white to coal cinder black, a spectrum encompassing such permutations as light, fair, clear, clammy cherry, gooseberry, ginger, spoil yam, sapodilla, olive, yellow, red, weak tea, high brown, musky, dusky, Milo, and brown. Though the melanometer can be thrown off in the presence of British tourists who tend to overexpose in the heat, it is essential that its first reading be trusted before the eyes have a chance to adjust. This will serve as the baseline. Now, if the ATF reads gooseberry or darker, adjust it according to the presence of the following: late model phones, lighter; raffia baskets, darker; loud conversations with much gesticulation in European sounding languages, lighter; in local dialect, darker; eating from a greasy paper bag with visible napkin, lighter; without, darker; gold, rings, lighter; teeth, darker. Lastly, fine-tune the reading based on the following criteria: recognition of faces, accuracy of past readings, gut reaction, appraisal of own decency, faith in value of exercise. With practice, all this occurs in a fraction of a second, down in the folds of the subconscious, resulting in a final crowd decency rating on, say, a scale of 1, darkest, lowest, to 10, lightest, highest. It is wondrous in its subtlety, like breathing or swallowing, a complex exercise one learns to perform without thinking. Standing there with her arms folded, Lizette did not realize that the figure she had assigned her surroundings upon arrival was a 7.2. The ATF had come in at a respectable enough weak tea, but on the way in from the car park, she had seen a woman with a raffia basket slapping a little boy who seemed to have spilled something down his shirt, and this had put her off enough to send the decency factor tumbling. Oblivious to the workings of her melanometer, Lizette stiffened her upper back and hoped, as her eyes wafted over the tour guides laminated like the placards they held aloft, the clumps of taxi drivers ready to pounce, and the wide, empty gangway through which their prey would soon pour, that the new Sabri would not find the place too provincial. After all, she could never have become what she was had she stayed. It had not been in the cards for her.